Wang Lin was half distracted when it happened. The control room was as quiet as it ever was, the hum of the power grid the only constant sound that filled the air. He was alone at the station, late shift again. It wasn't that Wang Lin minded the silence. In fact, it was one of the things he liked most about his job. Being a power engineer meant that you didn't have to deal with customers, politicians, or the usual headaches. The job was simple: monitor the system, troubleshoot when necessary, and keep the lights on. But tonight, the usual calm was broken by a strange vibration in the air. He leaned back in his chair, glancing up at the wall of monitors. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible flicker in the power grid. He noticed it because of the sudden change in the hum of the machines. It was like a faint pulse, a gentle but distinct shift that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He chalked it up to a minor glitch in the system, something that wouldn't need his attention until the morning crew came in, but before he could dismiss the thought, the flickering intensified. It wasn't just a glitch anymore, it was a surge that came from nowhere. Wang Lin frowned, his fingers hovering over the console. The power lines outside the building were shaking, and the faint buzzing in the room grew louder, like the sound of static before a storm. Then the power went out. The entire room went pitch black for a split second. Wang Lin had no time to react. He reached instinctively for the emergency backup switch, but before his hand could even touch the panel, a sudden burst of energy coursed through his body. It wasn't just an electrical shock, it was something more, something that felt like the very essence of energy itself. He froze, feeling the jolt of electricity dance through his fingers, his heart racing. It wasn't painful. In fact, it was almost pleasurable. A warmth spread through his chest, and a strange sensation of power filled him, making his body feel lighter, more alive. In the silence that followed, Wang Lin didn't know what had just happened. He sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what he had felt. The lights flickered back on, and everything seemed to return to normal. But Wang Lin wasn't normal. He could feel it now. The tingling sensation still radiated through his skin. He muttered under his breath. It was impossible. He couldn't have. But something inside him told him he had. He had somehow absorbed the energy from the grid, become one with it. Confused, he sat back in his chair, his mind racing. What had just happened? Was it a freak accident? Was his body somehow connected to the grid now? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thoughts. It didn't make sense. He was just a power engineer. He wasn't some kind of conduit for electricity. But that night, something inside him changed. The following day, Wang Lin tried to go about his routine like nothing had happened. He didn't mention the incident to anyone. After all, it wasn't like he could explain it. How do you tell someone that you think you just became part of the power grid? But something was different. As he sat in the cafe near his apartment that morning, sipping his coffee, he noticed the lights overhead flickering, just like they had at the station. He watched as the bulb above him pulsed slightly, and without even thinking about it, his hand reached up toward it. The moment his fingers were near the light fixture, the flickering stopped. The bulb steadied. Wang Lin blinked in confusion. Was it him? He didn't know why he thought it, but somehow, it felt like his presence had affected the electricity. Whoa, he muttered to himself. No way. He pulled his hand back and looked around the cafe. The barista was busy with an order, and the other customers were oblivious to the fact that the lights above them had just been affected by an invisible force. Wang Lin's curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to experiment. He focused on the coffee machine across the room. With a deep breath, he willed the machine to turn on. And it did. The lights inside the machine flickered to life. He barely moved a muscle, but he knew it had worked. Okay, he said to himself, voice shaky. I need to get a grip on this. Over the next few days, Wang Lin began testing his newfound ability. He spent hours walking through the city, intentionally interacting with anything powered by electricity. The results were unpredictable but increasingly impressive. He could influence streetlights with a glance, make vending machines buzz to life, and even cause the traffic lights to change when he focused hard enough. Each experiment only confirmed what he had feared. He was somehow attuned to electricity in a way no one else could understand, yet, as much as he marveled at his abilities, he couldn't ignore the creeping sense of danger. There was something volatile about the power he now wielded. It wasn't just a matter of flipping a switch or turning something on. He was beginning to feel the tug of the energy, a magnetic pull that almost seemed to demand his attention. It wasn't enough to control the small things, it wanted more. The larger systems, the entire grid, called to him, buzzing in his mind like a symphony he couldn't quite understand. One evening, as Wang Lin walked home, he felt a familiar spark. This time, however, it wasn't just the usual hum of nearby power lines. It was something bigger. The world around him seemed to vibrate with energy. He could hear the electric hum of the city, the rush of current flowing through buildings, buses, and lights. He focused harder, and suddenly, everything clicked. The traffic lights blinked in unison, the streetlights flickered erratically, and the sound of the city became a chaotic cacophony of buzzing and whirring. He realized he was controlling it. He hadn't meant to, but the flow of electricity seemed to respond to his every thought. "Okay, this is bad," Wang Lin said, trying to calm himself. His pulse quickened as he realized just how much power was surging through him. His heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't in control of it anymore. The electricity was flowing faster, more erratically, as though it had a mind of its own. In a panic, he tried to focus on calming the energy, but the harder he concentrated, the worse it became. Lights exploded. Cars skidded to a halt as their electronic systems malfunctioned. Street lamps flickered wildly, and in the distance, he saw an entire building's lights go dark. It was as if the grid itself was collapsing. Wang Lin took a deep breath, realizing he was on the brink of losing control completely. His powers weren't just affecting small devices anymore, they were threatening the entire city. For the next few days, Wang Lin kept his distance from the grid. But the damage had already been done. The city was on edge, and rumors of strange electrical disturbances spread like wildfire. People whispered about blackouts, traffic jams, and inexplicable power failures. News reports began to cover the events. They called it a mysterious malfunction, but Wang Lin knew the truth. He wasn't sure how long he could keep his abilities hidden. Worse still, he had no idea how to stop them from spiraling out of control. In his desperation, he turned to the one person who might understand what was happening, Professor Li, an eccentric scientist who specialized in electromagnetic fields. She was a former colleague of his, someone who had always been fascinated by the interplay between the human body and electrical currents. Wang Lin explained his situation to her, but even she was baffled. "You're saying," she said, eyes wide with disbelief, "that you're somehow attuned to the city's electrical grid? That you can control it?" Wang Lin nodded. "It's like I can feel it now. The current is in me, and when I try to hold it back, it just explodes." "Interesting," Professor Li muttered, looking at him with a mixture of fascination and concern. "We'll need to run some tests, but I'm afraid this is more serious than we thought. It's not just your brain or your body, this might be something that's changing you at a fundamental level." Wang Lin swallowed hard. "Then what can I do?" Professor Li adjusted her glasses, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "The first step is understanding your limits. You need to learn how to control it before it controls you." Wang Lin barely slept that night. The events of the past few days, his accidental manipulation of the power grid, the chaos that followed, looped in his mind like a persistent, gnawing hum. His thoughts, like the lights in the city, flickered on and off, oscillating between disbelief and the undeniable truth. He had somehow become part of the electricity that flowed through his world. He couldn't escape it. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the faint, rhythmic pulse of power coursing just beneath the surface of his skin. At first, he had been fascinated by the new ability, even excited. But now, it terrified him. He could control the flow of energy, sure. But was he losing control of himself? The following morning, he arrived at Professor Lee's lab before the sun was fully up. It was an old building on the outskirts of the city, a place where eccentricity seemed to hang in the air like static. Professor Lee greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, not quite noticing the weary look in his eyes. Come in, she called from the doorway, her voice warm with excitement. I've been thinking about your case all night, and I think I have some ideas. Wang Lin stepped inside, taking a deep breath. The lab was a cluttered mess, filled with strange gadgets, wires, and flashing screens. He barely noticed it anymore. He had been here so many times before, working late on projects. But today, the chaos felt different. It was as if the disorder mirrored the turmoil inside him. Professor Lee led him to a table where she had laid out a set of monitors and strange instruments designed to measure electromagnetic fields and bioelectric activity. Sit here, she said, patting a chair. We need to track your electrical readings. If we're going to understand what's happening to you, we need data. Wang Lin sat down, feeling a little self-conscious. He could sense the electricity in the air, could almost taste it, the buzz surrounding every wire, every piece of machinery. He wasn't sure if it was his heightened senses playing tricks on him or if it was something deeper, something more insidious. But what scared him the most was the idea that he might not even need the equipment to track his powers anymore. He could feel the current in his fingertips, the strange power that now thrummed through his veins. Professor Lee attached a series of small sensors to his temples, his wrists, and the base of his neck. The wires snaked across his skin, an eerie reminder of the invisible energy flowing just beneath. She flipped a switch, and the machines hummed to life, filling the room with a soft, metallic noise. Relax, she said, her voice gentle but focused. Let's see if we can pinpoint the source of your power. Wang Lin closed his eyes and tried to follow her instructions, focusing on his breathing. But it was hard to ignore the constant buzzing in his head, the pulsing energy that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The sensors on his skin started to glow faintly, as though they were reacting to something that wasn't just his body but something more. Professor Lee adjusted a dial on one of the monitors, her brow furrowing. This is odd, she murmured. The readings aren't just showing electrical activity. They're showing something else. Wang Lin opened his eyes. What do you mean? I mean, she said slowly, your body isn't just conducting electricity. You're generating it. Wang Lin's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected as much, but hearing it aloud made it feel far more real, far more dangerous. So, I'm not just a conduit. I'm like a battery? Professor Lee nodded, her expression serious. Exactly. You've become something like an energy source. But it's more than that. You're tuned to the grid. You're attuned to every electrical current around you. That sounds impossible, Wang Lin said, shaking his head. He felt his skin crawl, the tingling sensation flaring up in his fingertips. I don't even understand how this is happening. How did it happen? Professor Lee adjusted her glasses, looking thoughtful. It could be the result of the accident at the power station. The surge of energy you absorbed might have fundamentally altered the way your body interacts with electricity. But this is beyond my expertise. I think we need someone with a deeper understanding of bioelectrical systems, someone who can help you manage your powers. Wang Lin swallowed, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Manage them? How am I supposed to manage this? I can't even control it now. Last night, everything I touched seemed to. He stopped himself, glancing at the door to make sure no one was listening. I almost caused a blackout last night. A citywide blackout. Professor Lee's eyes widened. A blackout? Are you serious? I was walking down the street when he stopped, feeling a cold sweat start to gather on his neck. It was like the power just followed me. It started with the streetlights. Then it spread. I couldn't stop it. I had to leave before it got worse. Professor Lee took a deep breath. Wang Lin, this is more dangerous than I realized. We need to act quickly before it gets out of control. We'll need a plan. Wang Lin didn't want to think about what could happen if things got worse. He didn't want to imagine a city in chaos, its infrastructure crashing down because of his inability to control the power surging through his body, but he didn't have a choice. They spent the rest of the day running tests and analyzing the data. Each reading confirmed what Wang Lin had feared: his connection to electricity wasn't just mental, it was biological. His nervous system had somehow become integrated with the city's power grid, making him both a conduit and a generator of electrical energy. And as his powers grew stronger, they became harder to control. It was only when night fell that Wang Lin realized just how much danger he was in. The next day, Wang Lin barely slept again. But it wasn't because of the fear that had gnawed at him the night before. It was something else, something more pressing, more immediate. Something he could feel deep inside his bones. He didn't know what had triggered it, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, he felt the pull once more. It was the electricity. It started slowly, a small flicker, like the hum of a faulty light bulb. But then it surged. It wasn't just a physical sensation, it was a mental one. His thoughts were clouded, his heart racing, the very air around him crackling with energy. He could feel every electrical wire, every circuit, every pulse of power moving beneath the city, like a living thing. And then, it broke loose. The lights in his apartment went dark, then came back on, flickering erratically. The hum of the grid grew louder, like a scream in his ears. Wang Lin jumped to his feet, but it was already too late. The surge had started. The power wasn't just following him anymore, it was consuming him. He reached out, trying to steady himself, but the energy was like a tide, rising, swelling. His hands crackled with static. He could hear the faint whine of malfunctioning electronics in the building, the groan of wires under pressure. He stumbled forward, trying to focus, trying to stop it, but his power had already become uncontrollable. The lights in his apartment burst with a pop. His phone vibrated violently, then went dead. The surge continued. He felt it in his chest, in his head, like it was rewiring his thoughts, forcing him to obey its will. The world around him was dissolving into chaos, and he was powerless to stop it. In the distance, a sudden explosion of light filled the sky. It was the city. The power grid was failing. The sirens outside screamed like distant wails of an impending catastrophe. Wang Lin stood by the window, his heart hammering as he looked down at the chaos unfolding below. The streets were clogged with stalled cars, their engines dead, as if the very city itself had been paralyzed by the blackout. People wandered aimlessly, their faces etched with confusion, their cell phones useless, flickering in their hands. The lights that usually adorned the skyline were now dark, their usual glow swallowed by the darkness, leaving only a few emergency lights scattered across the city like desperate beacons. Wang Lin's mind raced, the gnawing realization that he had caused all of this eating away at him. His powers had spiraled beyond his control, and now the city, his city, was paying the price. He could feel the hum of the grid in the back of his mind, like a constant presence that would not be ignored. The surge he had triggered wasn't just confined to his building, it had spread, consumed everything in its path, leaving the city's infrastructure in ruins. He reached for his phone, but it buzzed in his hand before he could unlock it, flashing erratically before the screen went dark. No use. It was all down. All of it. His phone rang. He hesitated before answering, recognizing the number of Professor Lee, her name flashing on the cracked screen. Wang Lin, she said, her voice shaky, but urgent. What happened? The entire city's gone dark. I'm hearing reports of power surges all across the district, buildings are failing, and the grid is unstable. It's your power, isn't it? Wang Lin swallowed, the truth sitting heavy in his throat. I didn't mean for it to happen. I couldn't control it. He stopped, biting back the panic that threatened to consume him. What do I do, Professor? We need to get you out of there. It's not safe anymore, she said, her voice a little softer now, but still stern. You're a danger to everyone. You have to leave the city before it gets worse. I can't just leave. I can't just run away from this, Wang Lin said, his voice rising despite himself. He could feel his power, even now, throbbing inside him, aching to be unleashed again. He clenched his fists, trying to force the electricity down, but it was futile. It was alive, moving under his skin, pushing at the edges of his control. You have to try, Wang Lin. The more you resist, the more dangerous you become. You don't know what's happening to you. The surge, it's like nothing I've ever seen before. If you stay in the city, you could, her voice faltered, and for the first time, Wang Lin heard real fear in her tone. You could destroy everything. You have to leave. Now. Wang Lin felt his pulse quicken, the hum of electricity vibrating in his bones, the city's power grid singing its seductive, insistent tune in his mind. He couldn't deny it any longer. He was no longer just an engineer working a simple job, he was something far more dangerous. And the city, its people, its structures, was paying the price for his power. I'll go, he said, his voice low, resigned. But where do I go? I'll help you, Professor Leith said, her voice steady again. There's a lab in the outskirts, a place where we can try to get some control over your abilities. It's a secluded area, far from the city's grid. We need to isolate you, find a way to reverse this. Wang Lin nodded, even though he knew she couldn't see it. All right. I'll be there. He disconnected the call and grabbed a jacket, heading for the door. The city outside was a wreck, but he couldn't stay here any longer. Not when every step he took seemed to make the grid more unstable. Every thought, every emotion, every ounce of energy he exerted was feeding the chaos. As he stepped outside, the electric pulse in the air was palpable, making his heart race faster with each breath. The streets were silent, save for the sound of distant shouting and the low hum of malfunctioning electronics. He tried to ignore it, pushing forward toward his destination. The streets had always been familiar to him, a backdrop to his quiet life. But now, they felt alien, hostile. The energy in the air was a constant presence, thrumming with an intensity that made him feel like he was walking through a live wire. He had to move quickly. The more he lingered, the more dangerous it became. His powers were feeding off the energy around him, amplifying with every passing second. He turned a corner, and suddenly, the streetlights overhead flickered and went out. A soft jolt of electricity ran through his fingers, but this time, it wasn't accidental. He could feel it, like an electric pulse coursing through his hand. It wasn't a glitch, it wasn't a random surge, it was him. The energy responded to him, followed him, even when he didn't want it to. He stopped dead in his tracks, realizing that he wasn't just an observer in this chaos. He was causing it. Before he could take another step, the ground beneath him shuddered. He looked up, his stomach dropping as the lights of an entire building began to flicker and flash, bright, frantic bursts of electricity that lit up the sky like fireworks. His heart raced. He hadn't meant to do it. He couldn't have. But somehow, he had. Control it, he whispered to himself. Focus. Don't let it. But it was already too late. The surge of energy shot out from his body like a bolt of lightning. The streetlights around him exploded in a shower of sparks, and the hum of the grid vibrated in his chest, louder than ever. He staggered back, covering his ears, as the world around him seemed to collapse into chaos. Cars screeched to a halt. Windows shattered. Buildings groaned. The power grid, his power, was breaking down, spreading across the city like wildfire. He could feel it all, every last ounce of energy, consuming him, swallowing everything in its path. Stop it, he shouted, his voice a raw, desperate plea, but the energy refused to listen. The hum of the grid grew louder, more frantic, until it was all-consuming. It felt like the city itself was crying out, screaming for help, and Wang Lin was the only one who could stop it. But he didn't know how. He collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with the strain of the power inside him. He could feel the electricity coursing through his veins, his heart pulsing with every surge. It wasn't just his body anymore. The city was alive with it, alive with his power, and it was too much. As he sat there, the distant wail of sirens reached his ears again. This time, however, he didn't hear just the sirens. He heard the sound of 1,000 machines failing, the shriek of dying systems, the groan of crumbling infrastructure. The world around him was falling apart, and it was his fault. His hands shook as he reached up to touch his face, trying to steady himself. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This wasn't what he had wanted. But now, there was no turning back. He didn't know how long he stayed there, sitting in the middle of the chaos, feeling the grid collapse around him. He only knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay. Not like this. He had to get out of the city, away from the power, away from the chaos he had caused. He stumbled to his feet, heart racing, every breath shaky. The ground beneath him felt unstable, like it was vibrating with energy. The city was breaking, its lifeblood, the power, being drained by his very presence. And he was the only one who could stop it. Wang Lin didn't look back as he made his way down the street, feeling the electric pulse within him grow fainter with each step he took away from the city. But the journey was far from over. The city was just the beginning. The real battle, his fight for control, was yet to come.